Welcome back to another episode of Stand on Guard. This is your host, David Krayden, coming at you live from Ottawa. And we try to do this live every day. Part of this broadcast won't exactly be live. It's a recording of an interview I had yesterday, and that's the premier event. We're going to be getting that shortly. But before we do, a couple of things to talk about.
The Prime Minister lied and his minions continue to lie.
We need political change. But we also need to resolve to resist. And thank you for watching. Please subscribe. We've had a real dearth of subscribers. I think YouTube is preventing people from subscribing, is unsubscribing. Check to see if you've been unsubscribed, please. Because I'll tell you why. Because I suspected a lot of people were unhappy that I was talking about the Mideast. And this is a sneak preview of what I'm going to be showing you tomorrow. We have some polling on whether or not Canadians and Americans really want the United States or Donald Trump to initiate a strike against Iran and to become literally enmeshed into this war, in a shooting war. Now, I did a poll asking, should the U.S. intervene in the Israel-Iran conflict or stay out of foreign wars, as President Trump promised? 79% of you said yes, stay out. And that's, and sorry, 79% of you said no, the U.S. should not intervene. So I think, that indicates that a lot of you are really not enthused about this. Now, and tomorrow I've got other polls to show you. And and I've got a Substack going up this afternoon about this very issue. I think it's reasonable. I think it's something that we really need to understand right now. There's nothing inevitable about war. We can give peace a chance. And that's how I start this column. But here's another story about those arson incidents. 30 incidents under investigation for arson related to the wildfires. And what did we hear within hours of the wildfires outbreak? Has to be climate change. Couldn't be anything else. Well, clearly it's something else called arson. These people are crazy. Starting fires, and I think because they're trying to link it to climate change. That's how nuts these people are. I would point you towards my latest article in Blaze Media, which just came out last night, Canada's Solution to Reliance on the U.S., Increasing Commitments to Europe. This is all about how Mark Carney wants to spend $225 billion. That's billion with a capital B, on rearming Europe. This is insane. This is absolutely insane. As I promised, we're going to get to that John Carpay interview. This is really worth watching because we get into the latest toxic bills from the Carney government and why they're toxic. We specifically deal with Bill C2 and Bill C5 and how Carney is probably going to revisit the Online Harms Act. So this is very serious. I want to play a bit of this. This is Michael Barrett talking about how the Conservatives won something in Parliament here.
Commons, and this is big news. We had an Opposition Day motion last week that was on notice in my name, along and seconded by my colleague Kelly McCauley. You'll know him from the Mighty Ogo, where Kelly's the chair. And this motion was about the $64 million in the Arrive scam, which the Auditor General determined was a project where there is, in many cases, no proof that the work that was paid for by taxpayers was done, that security clearances weren't in place where they needed to be in place, and the government initially, the Liberals, voted against having the Auditor General even investigate. So we put this motion on notice last week, and we used it as our Opposition Day. And there's a lot of things we could use for an Opposition Day motion, but here is a case where it's tens of millions of taxpayer dollars in a time when Canadians are struggling to get by, and we have the Liberals with Prime Minister Carney saying it's a new government, he's a new Prime Minister, it's going to be new days and new ways. So we said, you know what, let's give them a chance to do the right thing.
The wrong thing. But that, well, I'm going to play the rest of that tomorrow because I don't want to go too much overtime here so we can have time for the interview. But I want to show you Andrew Scheer really hit the bell yesterday about what's going on with this liberal desire to outlaw, phase out gas-powered engines, gas-powered vehicles. What are they? Why are they doing this?
Oral questions, questions orales. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
This Liberal government is doubling down on its insane ban on gas-powered vehicles. The latest Liberal overreach kicks in next year, and soon your favorite car, truck, and van will be illegal. But this mandate is already driving up prices. The average price of a new car is $67,000. Used cars are approaching $40,000, and this Liberal mandate will add an additional $20,000 per vehicle. They've already priced working Canadians out of the housing market. Why are they pricing working Canadians out of the ability to buy a vehicle as well?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Climate Change.
Mr. Speaker, first let's start with the facts, which is there is no ban on gas-powered vehicles. But more to the point, let's also say, once again, we're seeing the Conservatives talking.
There's a ban in place in 2035, Julie. Environment and Climate Change Minister. That's what Andrew's referring to.
Down one of our most important industries, employing hard-working auto workers in our country at the very moment that we're facing terrorist threats from the United States. I find it rich that they are choosing to take this position instead of talking up a growing and important industry. We stand with our auto workers.
Leader of the Opposition.
There absolutely is a ban. It starts to come into effect next year, and it will absolutely devastate the auto sector here in Canada. The auto sector is already under fire from unjustified U.S. tariffs and the PM's inability to get a deal, but GM, Ford are all saying that this ban will kill jobs. In fact, a new report says that this ban on gas-powered vehicles will kill 90,000 auto jobs. Instead of sending even more jobs to the U.S., why not end the ban on gas-powered vehicles and let Canadians decide what kind of vehicle they want to buy?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Climate Change.
Mr. Speaker, it's nice to hear that they're finally recognizing that we're talking about an industry that's facing unjustified tariffs from the United States.
That's right.
But let's also talk about how our auto sector is important. We need to support it in this moment. It's creating good-paying union jobs in our country. And the EV standard actually makes sure that new electric vehicles are available to Canadians. They're cheaper to operate, they're cheaper on upkeep, and Canadians want to be able to have access.
They're not cheaper on upkeep. You can't keep your electric car charged and do the laundry in the same week. That's how cheap they are.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
You don't have to allow Canadians to buy one type of vehicle by banning their ability to buy the ones that they actually want. But, you know, this is raising a lot of questions. Canadians, auto workers, Ford, GM, they all don't want the EV mandate, but the Prime Minister is intent on pushing it through. Why? Well, right before becoming Prime Minister, he was chair of Brookfield, and he advocated for a ban on gas-powered cars. Brookfield is heavily invested in the EV supply chain. Yet this Prime Minister refuses to reveal his financial interests or self-admitted conflicts. Isn't it true that this isn't about the environment, this is about the bottom line for Brookfield?
And folks, it always goes back to Brookfield Asset Management. When you're talking about why Mark Carney makes decisions, why Mark Carney behaves he does, and why Mark Carney is the way he is. Now, without further ado, let's get to this interview with John Carpay. I hope you enjoy this, folks. John is a good friend and a fantastic fan of this station, and he's always welcome here. Well, welcome back to Stand on Guard. I'm very happy to have John Carpay of the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms back on the show. John's been here before. The last time around, John, we were talking about Bill C-63, and you were taking your message to Canadians across the country about how dangerous this bill was, and we'll get back to how the Liberals are going to revisit that bill, I'm sure. But want to lead off with Bill C2, which I think the Conservatives were a little slow to recognize as being as bad as it is. I didn't hear a lot of discussion about it. And when Pierre Poilievre was asked by a reporter, what do you think about Bill C2? Do you think this is a danger? And he said, well, we'll have to look at the bill more closely. A couple of days later, of course, Calgary Nose Hill Member of Parliament Michelle Rempel Garner got up and started talking about Bill C2 as being potentially dangerous. Now, why do you think this bill could be one of the most toxic pieces of legislation the Liberals have ever tried to foist on this country?
In a nutshell, the bill, if passed in its current form, would give government officials power to access all kinds of information about citizens without a search warrant. Now, as kind of as background, the way that our criminal justice system has been functioning generally the past 157 years since Confederation, and even prior to that, there's a presumption that a citizen has a right to privacy, a citizen has a right to security in their home. Police or other law enforcement cannot barge into your home. The government does not have some sort of a God-given right to have all kinds of information about everybody, and who's subscribing to Rogers and who's on Netflix and who stayed at which hotel when and who's renting a car, etc. Now, law enforcement needs to do their job. So we've struck a balance the past 157 years whereby if the police have reasonable and probable grounds to think that somebody is engaging in crime, maybe something to do with child pornography or weapons or fraud, whatever. If they have reasonable and probable grounds, the police can go to a judge and they can apply for a search warrant. They have to swear an affidavit indicating what information they have and why they think that that person should be further investigated, why that individual's privacy rights should be violated because he or she is probably engaging in criminal conduct. They get a narrow search warrant that allows them to barge into one home only, and that's the home of somebody where they have reasonable grounds to think that the criminal activity is taking place. Everybody else, their home is sacrosanct. The police can't barge in. It's the same for information. If let's say the police think that somebody named Mark Smith, my apologies to all the Mark Smiths out there, if they think that Mark Smith is involved in producing, distributing child pornography, they can go to a big company like Rogers and say, look, we suspect Mark Smith of such and such, we want some information on him. And if the company doesn't comply, police can get a search warrant or a court order. And so there too, you only have, and then they could look at his email and, maybe get into his computer, look at his internet activity, whatever. So this is just background information. What C2 does is it gives government this broad access without a search warrant to get the names and IP addresses and subscriber data of every business in Canada, whether you're a hotel or a car rental company, whether you're a church, a charity, a nonprofit. The government would get legal access to say to the church, we want your email list. And we want the names and email addresses of all the people. Most churches, I assume, they've got an email list. They might have an email newsletter, like most groups do. And so that's a really scary part, is that government would get access to massive amounts of information about Canadians.
Yeah, I think that's what concerns me about this bill. It would force me to actually hand over a list of subscribers and their addresses, which I think is a huge invasion of privacy. But the internet access, of course, and the surveillance concerns me, because that's what this government has been doing for the last 10 years. I know Mark Carney likes to call it Canada's new government. He won't even call it Canada's Liberal government. And I think there's a method to that, and method to his madness there. But before I got into, I found it fascinating that this bill would allow the RCMP and Canada Post workers to open mail. Now, people might say, well, I don't send a lot of information out by mail, but you would recall the McDonald Commission of the 1970s, which was targeting the RCMP operations at that time, which was opening people's mail. And the government argued at the time that we needed to create a spy agency or an intelligence network in this country to do that instead. So we would entrust that to what eventually became the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, CSIS, which was created as a result of the McDonald Commission. But here we have a bill that's actually advocating we go back to a Canada where the RCMP is opening our mail, and is compounding it by saying a Canada Post workers can open our mail, and without a warrant. And I find this to be just, once again, you don't have to go too deep into Mark Carney's legislation to find the toxicity in it and to find the poison pill. And did this sort of astound you that once again the government is recommending the RCMP get into the opening of mail business?
It's the same. It's the same attitude. It's the same spirit that the government is entitled to become as omniscient as it would like to be and just get all this information. Now, people who are ignorant of history, they have this naive trust in government. Government would never harm us. Government would never lie to us. Government has our best interests at heart. Which only those who are ignorant of history could have that kind of an attitude. But unfortunately, there are a lot of people in this country who have this naive fairy tale-like trust, which would be, an appropriate attitude for a kindergarten student to have towards their teacher, or for a 3, 4, 5, 6-year-old to have towards their parents. There's a time and a place for that kind of an attitude. But those who know history will know that in the 20th century, in the 1900s, more people were murdered by their own government, and that includes Soviet Union under Stalin and other brutal dictators, China under Mao, Germany under the National Socialists, Nazi-occupied Europe, Pol Pot in Cambodia. More people were murdered by their own government than the number of soldiers who died in the battlefield, which was also a huge number, of course. And so the point is not, well, I've got nothing to fear. If Canada Post opens my mail, they're just going to see a friendly letter to my Aunt Martha wishing her a happy birthday, and I don't care if anybody sees that. It's not the point. The point is that you don't want to give government this access to intrude into privacy and to gather all this information. And for true crime, and that crime is a problem, we need to fight it. The police can go and get a search warrant, and they can open the mail of one targeted individual when they get a court approval to open the mail of Mark Smith. They can do that. But to twist that into some broader right where any Canada Post worker on some reasonable suspicion decides to open mail is just it's creepy. It's totalitarian. It's inviting tyranny.
Well, there's a great line from the mystery novel The Maltese Falcon, and which of course is a famous film about everybody has something to hide, which is what Sam Spade says to the police at one point. Everybody's got something to hide, so let's not pretend that there isn't a hidden motive here. But I find this to be just indicative of this government right now, and how it really believes it has the right to take away privacy. And what really concerns me here, John, is that government's discovering information in people's files, on their computers, in their mail, that wasn't there to begin with. Because we know when governments want to cancel people, well, how did that get on the computer? And I don't trust this government to not lay their evidence, to not actually plant evidence if they're looking to destroy somebody. And I can see this being a huge problem for all of us who are doing social media broadcasts such as this show here, which consumes a lot of my time. I still do stories for media outlets other than my own, but this is a driving force in my life right now. And I know there are people who I offend, largely the Mark Carney liberals right now, who would just love to shut this down on the basis of any criteria. So I worry about government's planting evidence, but I also worry about the third component of this bill, which is the promise of a cashless society, or the threat of a cashless society. Because here we go. Transactions above $10,000 will be banned. You can put it in the bank, but don't expect to take it out and use it. And I think I heard you say the other day, you were being interviewed and saying, well, if you can say 10,000, you can say 5,000. If you can say 5,000, you can say 1,000. And you can take that marker down until you're basically dealing with petty cash. And I think the government would love to have this digital currency. Mark Carney has been arguing for it for most of his professional life as a governor of two banks, Bank of England, Bank of Canada. He's advocated it at economic summits, where he's also talked about the Chinese currency replacing the US dollar as the global currency of choice. But he's talked extensively about digital currency, how this makes us safer. And of course, no, it doesn't make us safer. It makes us more inclined to be abused by governments that will then know exactly how I'm spending my money, how I'm paying the bills, where my money is coming from, and everything about my personal choices that in some cases might be offensive to people in government and could be used against me. So what do you think about this component of the bill?
Well, a government that knows everything about you is a government that can take everything from you. And currently we have, I think, a healthy separation where a certain branch of government might know things about you. For example, if a police officer pulls you over for speeding, they've got a database there that will indicate where you live, and they look at your driver's license. And so the policeman will know where you live, whether there's an outstanding warrant for your arrest, whether you've got a criminal record. So the police have this information, but it's the police only, and it's not, you know, the health ministry or the transportation ministry or the minister of education that has that information. And in the same way, your doctor, you know, and maybe because we have a government controlled healthcare system, maybe the health department will have personal, private, confidential information about patients, but the police can't just call up the health ministry and say, hey, you know, give us Bob's medical history. Jason Kenney tried that in Alberta, by the way. That was eventually was defeated to give police access to medical records. So the important thing is that, okay, fine, different government departments for different reasons will have information on us. I mean, the CRA, the revenue branch, is going to have information on how much we earned and how taxes we've paid and, you know, charitable giving, but it's got to be kept separate. But now we've got this potential, you know, part of the drift, the general tendency in the last 5 years with legislation pertaining to the internet is to give government more and more control in the name of combating hate, which nobody can define because it's entirely subjective. And what ends up happening is when the government says it's banning hate speech, they're going to ban speech that they hate. And so, but getting back to your question, a government that knows everything about you is a government that can take everything from you. And so we need to, I hope we have a peaceful, massive uprising, and people contact their member of parliament to say this C2 is a dangerous violation of civil liberties, and people need to contact their MP, even if their MP is a member of the government party. It doesn't matter what party your MP is, she or he has to hear from constituents that C2 is very bad.
I would have to agree, and I would hope the Conservatives get a little more aggressive in opposing this bill, because so far I've gotten the sense from the official opposition right now they're just marking time until the summer vacation comes around. They've finally been raising the issue about the Liberals wanting to outlaw gas-powered engines in another 10 years. That's been, I think, their most successful point in question period. But they have avoided talking about Bill C2. And I think Bill C5, which I find fascinating, this of course, again, ostensibly is about eliminating interprovincial trade barriers. And the Conservatives love this bill, and they feel they really can't oppose it too strenuously and will probably be supporting it. But one of the Liberals' own members, who of course was very close to Justin Trudeau, he was in Mark Carney's first cabinet after he was appointed prime minister. I'm talking, of course, of Nate Erskine Smith, Ontario member of parliament, who was a minister, but was dropped by Carney in the second stage of his government. And he made it clear that he was not happy about being bounced from the cabinet, and he has been, I won't say a visceral opponent of Carney, but he has been not afraid to be critical. And he says he's not going to support Bill C-5 because the toxic pill in that one, of course, is that Mark Carney gets to approve. It's almost like on a personal basis, he gets to approve these capital projects that he keeps talking about. And Erskine Smith said yesterday in the House of Commons that he finds this to be a contravention of the process of approving these sorts of ventures. But I think there's also, and I've talked about this last week with Premier Daniel Smith, who was on the show, and I said my concern about Mark Carney's one government, when he keeps talking about we're going to have one government dealing with trade in this country, and we're going to reduce or eliminate all these interprovincial trade barriers. My concern is that he's trying to worm his way into federal, if not control, but at least federal influence over the provincial autonomy over natural resources. Now, as the Premier pointed out to me, these are rights that are guaranteed in the Constitution, and the Constitution would trump any legislation. However, I wouldn't put it past someone like Mark Carney to just ignore that and say, I'm not going to listen to the Supreme Court that says, hey, it's in the Constitution. The province reserves the right to natural resources, where they sell them, and what they're going to do with oil and gas, for instance, and especially in Alberta. But do you think there's a potential for Mark Carney to try to interfere with that long-standing provincial autonomy over natural resources, and for the federal government to once again, as it tried to do under Pierre Trudeau in the 1970s, try to get its hands on those natural resources?
Well, or prevent them from being developed, because if you buy into this wild theory that mankind controls the weather, mankind controls climate, which is demonstrably false when you look just even at the last 2,000 years, we've had significant decreases in temperature, that decreases, and there's no correlation with people, driving cars or heating their homes in winter. And mankind has flourished and prospered when 1,000 years ago the world's climate was 4 degrees warmer than what it is today, and now we're lighting our hair on fire or being terrified of a temperature increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we've got a hostility towards resource development, and that's a longstanding problem. When it comes to respecting the Constitution, we've had decades of the federal government not respecting the Constitution, especially in healthcare. The Constitution says that healthcare is exclusively a provincial jurisdiction, and yet we have the federal government indirectly controlling all of the healthcare systems in Canada by saying to the provinces, we're not going to fund you unless you comply with our conditions. And so you have these horribly inefficient and unaccountable government monopoly healthcare systems functioning in each province, and tens of thousands of Canadians have died on waiting lists. But the important point is that the provinces under the Constitution have the freedom to experiment with their own healthcare policies, and potentially, if the Constitution is being honored, provinces can learn from each other, and they might see something that works really well in BC and try to copy it, or see something that fails miserably in Ontario and try to avoid it. And so we've got that lack of respect for the Constitution has been a big problem for decades. It's not new.
Well, I would suggest it's not new, and we should always be vigilant in ensuring that the government does not contravene the constitutional guarantees. Although I really do think we're on the precipice of a much more authoritarian federal government than we've ever seen. Mark Carney is very good at masquerading as a small c conservative. He has literally stolen the talking points of the Conservative Party of Canada. He has literally stolen a lot of the campaign rhetoric of Pierre Poilievre in the Conservative Party of Canada. But I maintain, when Mark Carney talks about things like safety or safe streets or affordable housing, he's not talking about the same thing that conservatives are. I would say a safe street for Mark Carney is a lockdown street where people have curfew and they're not allowed to leave their homes. That would be a safe street to Mark Carney. Affordable housing, I don't believe he's thinking about the dream of so many Canadian families of having a single family dwelling, of having their own home. He would be content to see people living in slums or in government-style, Soviet-style block housing, which is how I like to describe it. And I think that's where we're going with Mark Carney's affordable housing. But he's very good at pretending he really understands the more moderate politicians in this country, that he can live with a conservative interpretation of the laws. He can live with a more conservative fiscal policy. But I don't think any of this is real. I don't think any of this is much more than a charade. And as Professor Jeffrey Sachs always likes to say, it's government shambolic behavior, that this is a sham and that there's nothing really behind it except a desire to co-opt his opponents, his political opponents, to get them on side, and God only knows where he goes from there. But and once again, I go back to talking to Daniel Smith last week. I said, is this a guy we can trust? And she says, we'll certainly work with him, but no. And she is not somebody we can trust, because she frankly described him as a socialist, which, of course, if you read Mark Carney's writings, this is a man who said he most admires Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin as his political heroes. Now, that should send a chill down the spine of any Canadian. And I don't know how many times I repeated that during the election campaign, or others repeated that. It's in his last book. He has said it at symposiums. However, the mainstream media never got down to that, never questioned that talking point. So I would ask you, is Mark Carney somebody Canadians can trust?
Look, I would answer by saying that politicians never, this is broader than Mark Carney, politicians never take away your rights and freedoms without offering a nice sounding pretext. And they will violate your freedom of speech in the name of stopping hate and stopping misinformation, stopping disinformation, which is, obviously a huge problem. Who gets to decide what is misinformation? Who gets to decide what's hate? Right? If they want to ban hate speech, but their goal is to ban speech that they hate. If they took away our right, our freedom to have Christmas dinner with our own parents in 2020 in the name of public health, all kinds of rights and freedoms were violated. And governments admitted this in the court actions that Justice Centre lawyers across Canada fought against the lockdowns and the vaccine passports. And governments admitted in court that, yes, these measures did violate the charter freedoms of conscience, religion, association, peaceful assembly, travel, mobility, bodily autonomy. Generally speaking, the governments admitted that in court, but they said it was justified under Section 1 of the charter. And historically, we've got the communists taking power in Russia, which became the Soviet Union, and they say, well, to fight against the evils of capitalism, we've got to shut down your churches or burn them, and we've got to send huge numbers of people off to Siberia, and we have to shoot people. But it's all in the name of creating the workers' paradise. Barely 10 years later, you've got Adolf Hitler in Germany pointing to the communist atrocities and promising to keep the Germans safe from communism. And so the politicians are, whenever they take away rights and freedoms, it's the surveillance state. It's got to be to protect us from crime and money laundering. It's always safety and security is trotted out as a pretext. And you'll never hear Mark Carney or any other politician say, they're power hungry and they just enjoy power, and they're dangerous tyrants and they want to oppress the population. That's not the kind of language that they use. So I'll make that broader point, without commenting necessarily about Mark Carney, that politicians never take away your rights and freedoms without offering a very nice sounding pretext.
Well, that's true. I worked for a few years on Parliament Hill, largely for Reform, Canadian Alliance, Conservative Party MPs. But I certainly left there thinking that there's one thing you can say about politicians is that you can always rely on them to let you down. And they'll do it every time. And
they're followers. They're followers.
Yeah.
They follow the culture. It's up to us. Sorry to interrupt. It's up to us to change the culture. Like, we can't have this victim mentality that, we're just going to be forever deceived and forever lied to and forever tricked. If it's impossible for politicians to oppress a well-informed citizenry of responsible, virtuous adults who take charge of their own lives, assume responsibility for their own lives, who are well-informed, it's impossible for a tyrant to oppress a free people. Like, it requires our buy-in and our cooperation to have our rights and freedoms taken away from us.
I guess my final question, because I don't think anybody fought quite as hard and long as you did on trying to get Bill C-63, the Online Harms Act, stopped or amended, changed to some degree. And we all breathed a sigh of relief when it never got past second reading and it died on the legislative floor. But I said, this is not the end. I know very, very well what's going to happen. And during the campaign, Mark Carney addressed the Online Harms Act by saying, great idea. It's all about safety, folks. It's about protecting our children from pornography, from child pornography. It's about stopping revenge porn. And of course, as you pointed out, and I pointed out at the time, these are already offenses that are covered by the criminal code. So why are we reintroducing them? Obviously, it's got nothing to do with protecting children or women or anything else. It's all about taking our free speech away, censoring us as the Liberals do every opportunity. And this odious bill with the thought crimes component, when people were laughing at us around the world saying, what kind of a country would have a thought crimes component? You're locked up in your house because your neighbor suspects you might say something hateful. And as you point out, who defines hateful? Who defines disinformation? And it's anything the government hates. Yeah, and that's what it comes down to. So my question for you, John, is, do you think I'm sure you agree we're going to see this bill resurface in some form. Do you think they will push it through the Attorney General or through Heritage, as the original bill, like 8 years ago, I think they first toyed with this idea, but it died. Once again, it died on the legislative table because Parliament ended and elections were called. That one died. But that, at the time, if I'm not mistaken, was going to be entered as legislation through the Heritage Minister. They changed that name around now, but it's the same Heritage Minister again. This time they call him the Minister of Canadian Identity. And it's none other than the former Environment and Climate Change Minister, who clearly is no friend of free speech. So do you think the Liberals will try to reintroduce this through the AG or through the Heritage Minister, because it might look less dangerous that way?
I have no idea how they're going to do it. It's unfortunate that Mark Carney has expressed support for the contents of Bill C-63. I think the important thing is for citizens to contact their MPs. Canadians are very good at complaining to each other, at the water cooler, at the workplace, family gatherings, et cetera, et cetera. Canadians are very good at complaining to each other, but politicians are followers, not leaders. And so if politicians sense that something is very unpopular, and you see this from time to time, there's a proposal put forward and there's such a massive public outcry that the government just drops it. We saw Stephen Harper a decade ago or so with this. He had a bill that had some similarities to Bill C2 that would give police the power to acquire massive amounts of information about citizens without a search warrant. And they dressed it up as fighting child pornography and the predators. And the minister famously said, either you're with us or you're with the child pornographers. But the pushback against it was so strong that they dropped that bill. If MPs, particularly liberal MPs, if they hear from their constituents that this bill is going to violate freedom of speech and it's unacceptable, and if people write in and say, if you vote for this, I'm voting against you in the next election, that's the way. Canadians have to be a lot more involved in the democratic process than what they are now.
I couldn't agree more, and that's what we need to get Canadians mobilized, common sense Canadians. Whether you're a small C conservative, small L libertarian, if you really don't want the government encroaching any further into our lives than it already has, we need to fight back. I think these are ominous times we're living in right now, not just in Canada, but if you see what's happening around the world and what potentially could be a catastrophic war in the Middle East. These are very ominous times, but I think we have to start at home, and we have to be very, very vigilant about opposing government overreach from the Mark Carney government. And I think it's very, very likely to happen from this government. So John Carpay, Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, thank you for the work you do, not just on these files that we talked about today, but for defending a lot of Canadians who couldn't defend themselves otherwise against government overreach and against laws that are meant to stymie our free speech, our freedom of assembly, and our freedom to be Canadian, which I think we're losing every year. So thank you so much for joining me today, John, and hope we see you back here to keep discussing these bills and these crises that are facing Canada.
Well, thanks so much for having me on your show, David. I look forward to the next time.
Okay, bye for now, John. And that, of course, was John Carpay. And always a pleasure to have John on the show. And we will have him back on again. But we are facing a number of crises in this country right now. We have to be vigilant. We have to keep fighting for freedom. If we stop fighting for freedom, who is going to do it for us? Famous line from my favorite film, Casablanca. Victor Laszlo was asked, why do you keep fighting? And he responds, you might as well ask, why do we keep breathing? If we stop breathing, we'll die. If we stop fighting, the world will die. Or in our case, Canada will die. So that's why we're keeping this up. YouTube sat on this episode like they don't want numbers. They don't want people to know it's on. They don't. But please share this broadcast with your friends and families. Resubscribe if you must, because I'm going to fight back. And thank you for your support. And we will see you again tomorrow, possibly this afternoon. I might have to do that. Bye for now. God bless Canada. God bless you. And this has been David Krayden broadcasting live.